Hey there, it's Corey with Ascend Smarter Intervention, and today I wanted to share with you some tips and strategies in terms of understanding evaluation results. One of the things that's really challenging about understanding evaluation results is that all of the tests that are given have different ways in which they are scored. And so depending on whether you're looking at a curriculum-based assessment, a progress monitoring type assessment, a state provided assessment, or a norm reference standardized assessment, those scores could look widely different, and it's really hard to know specifically what you're looking at. When you have a child who is undergoing testing for either a specific learning disability or for an individualized education program through the school, typically what we want to be looking at is we want to be looking at standardized norm referenced assessments. And the reason that we want to do that is we want to be able to see where a student's performance is in comparison to his or her peers. One of the best ways to do that is through standardized norm referenced assessment. What they're designed to do is they're designed to put students on a standard bell curve. If you remember statistics, you might remember that standard bell curve. And so essentially what they're doing is they're looking at where do we expect students to be falling or performing at? And then where are other students performing at in relation to your student? So when we're thinking about how we're going to look specifically at standardized norm referenced assessments, which are so key, so important, what we need to know is that most of these tests have a standard score of 100 or a scaled score of 10. So that's the thing that we need to keep in mind when we're looking at this graph that we're looking at right here. That standard score of 100 or scaled score of 10 is what we're getting right in the middle of that bell curve. And so what we're looking at is we're looking at assuming that that 100 standard score is right smack in the middle. So if you lined up 100 kids and they all took this test, and then you picked the one who performed right in the middle, they would have gotten 100 on that test. So it's a little bit different than thinking about a spelling test or something in which you want students getting 100%, because on those tests, those more what we would call curriculum measures or measures that are happening in the classroom, they are looking at how many questions were there and how many questions were answered correctly. In that case, you want students to be getting as many of those as possible correct. But in this case, we're looking at 100 a little bit differently. We're going to say that average students are going to fall within one standard deviation of 100. So what that means is if we lined all the kids up and looked at how they did on that test, if we took the middle student, the middle performer, their score became 100, and then all the other scores were normalized around that. And so what that means when we're looking at test scores, we want students falling ideally within the 90 to 110 standard score or above, right? If they're falling above that, then that's great, and they're even, more above where we would expect them to be. Now, anybody that's falling below a 90, those are the scores we want to start looking at. Now, that being said, if you're qualifying for an individualized education program, they're going to be a little bit more stringent on those scores. Oftentimes, what they're looking for is scores that are more than one standard deviation away from the average. And so what that means is the cut point for one standard deviation is a score of 85 or the 16th percentile. And so what schools do is they're often looking for scores that are falling below that number in order to qualify, and not just on one test, but on a group of tests. So we're really looking for a body of evidence. And a body of evidence means that we have a number of different scores that are supporting kind of that lower performance, or we've got a few scores that are at below that 85 standard score, and also we're seeing that there's difficulty at home, there's difficulty in the classroom. So those are the types of things that we're looking at. So what's important is when we're looking at cognitive assessments, so like IQ type assessments, or we are looking at academic assessments, as long as it's a norm referenced assessment, the average score should be 100. So what's important to do is to ask whoever is providing the assessments which of these are norm referenced, or what is the average, so then get an idea of what you're looking at. So again, when we're talking to families that are looking at a learning disability evaluation, we're saying that we're going to tight band that a 9 and 10 is considered within the average range. That's a little bit clearer of a band than this graph is showing, because we want to really be taking a look at outliers on both ends to see if we can find any other patterns of other things going on, especially depending on the school district or the rigor of the school. Sometimes if you're falling on that low average range, if your standard scores are in the 80s, the upper 80s, you're still struggling significantly in the classroom. And so it's important to recognize that even though, oftentimes in an individualized education program assessment or a special education eligibility, that's a challenge, assessment, they're going to look at those scores and average. That's fine. Sometimes when you get a lot of scores falling at what we would say those 80s ranges, those are going to be kiddos who are really good candidates for outside support, because they may not qualify through the school. They still need help. They're not doing well without that additional support. So it's important that we think about that. So keeping in mind when we're looking at interpreting evaluation assessment results, this is going to be specific to your IQ tests and your academic tests. Once we start looking too far outside of that, then we start getting some different scores. We might get T-scores, or I know locally we use measures of academic progress, or the MAPS testing. That scale is completely different. So it's important that we're taking a look at, okay, what is the scale that I'm looking at here? But in terms of learning evaluations, special education eligibility evaluations, these are often have scores falling at that 100 standard score or 10 scaled score mark. And so again, we want to make sure we want scores above the 16th percentile, because if they're falling below the 16th percentile, that means we lined 100 kids up and we picked the bottom 16, your child would fall in there, or your student would fall in there. And so it's important that we really keep that in mind. A lot of speech language assessments will also follow the standard bell curve. But once we start looking at attention, anxiety, executive functioning skills, a lot of those start having a different measure in terms of what that looks like. So we do have to be a little bit careful when we're interpreting results. But this is a quick tip in terms of what does it look like to look at those evaluation scores from a cognitive or an IQ perspective and an academic perspective. Hopefully that helped. Definitely let us know in the comments if you have any questions.